Welcome everybody to the first in a number of conversations with economists that will take place over the course of the academic year. This is a series that the economics department has been putting on for maybe going on 8-10 years now, and it's our way of trying to interact with students in a more informal manner to talk about the economy. So we've had over the years people that aren't necessarily academic economists come and speak about how they view different political or economic matters. Doesn't necessarily just have to be economics, as we're seeing politics and economics are pretty closely tied together. So is psychology these days. And we've had economics journalist Louis Uchachel, who's the chief economics correspondent for the New York Times. We've had President Sanchez de Lozada from Bolivia, former president of Bolivia here. We've had just a whole range of people. So please keep an eye on our website for announcements about our forthcoming conversations with economists. And if you have any suggestions about people you'd like to have us bring through, please do be in touch. And we have we get people from all different walks of life. Today I'm really honored and pleased to have Stu Taylor with us. Stu is a very prominent business radio talk show host in the Boston area, and so he's not a PhD in economics, but he is an economist. He knows lots of economics, and he's been talking to people about the economy on a daily basis for years now. He currently hosts 3 business shows. One is called Equity Strategies. It's on the Business Talk Radio Network. And there's another one on the Radio American Network, also called Equity Strategies. And then there's Stu Taylor on Business. That show airs on Business 1060, WBIX AM in the morning. I guess it's from 9 to 10 or something?
8 to 9, morning drive.
8 to 9. You may occasionally even hear me coming in on the show to sort Stu out.
He's referring to an hour conversation we just had prior to this.
Just had a little conversation about politics of late, but Stu's the author of an autobiographical business book entitled How to Turn Trends into Fortunes Without Getting Left in the Dust. I recommend it highly. Stu is an experienced speaker on the lecture circuit. He's appeared on cable television networks, including C-SPAN and CNN. He's been written up in Newsweek magazine, as well as many other newspapers and periodicals in the country. He's been featured on NPR and the BBC and the TV show American Journal, and also he's a frequent contributor to Fox Business Network. So Stu's going to talk to us. I asked Stu to come and talk to us about what he's hearing about this financial meltdown that we're experiencing. And this is a conversation, so it's supposed to include you folks too. So feel free to interrupt. I've got this microphone, so if someone wants to raise a question, since we're taping this, so that other people can come to our website and see it or weren't able to attend, I'm going to just bring over the mic to you, and I may interrupt or ask questions. But Stu's going to give us his take on how he sees what's happening, because we're in a very significant financial crisis right now. It's something that is of grave concern to the economy, to the economy and to the world, and it's of great delight, to tell you the truth, to economists, because we rarely get to see such interesting events. We're not happy about these events, but we're excited about them because they're intellectually very challenging and interesting. And but we're seeing major financial institutions melt down or be reorganized, and you can either look at this as very dangerous or not so dangerous, depending on, there's some yin and yang to this story. I'm going to let Stu take over and give us his take and what he's been hearing in his show. I'm going to shut the door so we don't have to compete with the noise here. But again, interact, okay? So if you have anything you need to ask right away, please do so. Otherwise, we're going to have some Q&A in about 55 minutes or so.
Okay, thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you having me. On behalf of a great institution, Boston University, it is indeed an honor. And Larry mentioned Bolivia, and that reminds me of Enrique Panaranda's mother, who once said, leading credence to the fact that we live in a knowledge-based society, that if I'd have known my son were going to be president of Bolivia, I would have taught him how to read and write. And we really live in that society, and I thank you for having me. It reminds me of what the late, great comedian Jack Benny once said. Thank you very much for that award. I really don't deserve it, but I have arthritis, and I don't deserve that either. And what's the point of that statement? The point of that statement is that you, as young people starting out, may inherit our problems, your fathers, your mothers, your grandparents, because of the lack of corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility, and the politics of the ages, whether you're Democrat or whether you're Republican. We're seeing certainly political partisanship that could affect the future generation for all of us, really. And prior to me coming in here and talking with you today, Professor Kotlikoff had invited me a while ago, and I found myself in Nantucket on vacation for 4 days this past weekend at the beautiful Century Inn there. And I said to my wife, I said, we've been traveling a lot. I said, this is it, 4 days away from everything. No newspapers, no television, no anything. We're just going to have a good time. We're going to do whatever people do when they go to Nantucket. And I had a different talk planned for today, as a matter of fact. But the sequence of events that have unfolded over the past several days have really necessitated this response, and to address an issue which I think is very, very critical. In the morning that I actually broadcast my show from out of the Century Inn on Monday morning, I had no idea what was going on, and I had on senior ABC News correspondent, foreign correspondent Jim Sciutto. He has a book out called Against Us, The Real Threat Facing Us, which is not Islam in and of itself, but it's all the factions that have grown up around the world to have anti-American sentiment. And that was the subject of my interview. And just before the show started, my producer Tim said, Jim Sciutto's ready to go when you are. And I just had a moment, and I said, great to have you on, Jim. Thanks very much. He was calling in from London. And he said, boy, it's amazing about what's going on today in economics. And bang, the music came, and I said to myself, this is really bad timing. Here I am going on with a couple of scheduled interviews. I don't have a clue what's going on. But I certainly found out after the show what happened, checking out CNBC and Fox. I hope that's not a dirty word around here. I guess that might give you a little idea of who I am. And other networks. And that really resulted in kind of a metamorphosis of what we're doing here today. I guess you can call it hip shooting or straight from the cuff, because we're dealing with an extraordinary situation. And I think it would be very inappropriate for me to come in here and certainly not address it, and I welcome your input as well. Here's the problem. I think we can define what the problem is, and it's a misuse of funds. It's talking about liquids that became illiquid, that were increased and magnified in value by entities like Fannie Mae and others, and then resold, values inflated, and suddenly a panic situation has come upon us. But the question is, I think we can dissect what the problem is today. It's not just this financial conundrum that we're in. We certainly have an energy policy that we have to be concerned with, the future of Social Security, healthcare system. Our primary issue, as I still believe it is, which is defense of our country and homeland security, what we need to do to protect ourselves. It's been 7 years. And it makes one wonder where the real problem lies, and whether we really want to take $700 billion, which may run to $1.5 trillion, in order to resolve a situation that we can't resolve. Because we can state the genesis of the problem, and we can state what the problem is. Here's what the real problem is as I stand up here and talk, and it wouldn't matter if you had Henry Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, whether you had Ben Bernanke, the head of the Fed up here, or the esteemed Professor Kotlikoff. Nobody can get a handle on what's going on today, and that is the great fear. So I'm not here to give you what I think is the solution to the problem, because I don't know which problem it is we should address. Many years ago, there was a famous congressman by the name of Senator Everett Dirksen, and he had a saying that stuck with me for years. You know, you spend $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're into some serious money. Now it's you spend $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, and now you're into some serious money. Do you know how scary it is? It's so scary that just last week, if you put your money into treasury notes, you know, nice, safe, secure treasury notes and bonds and places where you knew you didn't have to worry about losing it in the market, you'd really get back nothing for it. And if you factor in inflation, maybe you'd lose a penny or two. That's kind of the thinking today. That's how scared we are. And the psychology drives the markets. I guess most of you are in class. It's my rationalization why you didn't hear my show this morning. But I had on Diane Swonk, who to me is at the top of her field. She was the chief economist for Bank One, and she's now the chief economist for Mesirow Financial in Chicago. She was at the airport, but she consented to coming on to give her reflections on what we're dealing with today. And she has a book out. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. The Passionate Economist, Diane Swonk, how fear drives these markets. So if you're invested in the market, how many of you here are majoring in economics? Okay. That's great. How many in here now are so worried about the blood on the street? Charles Gasparino's book, you've seen him on CNBC, he's been on my show a number of times, that maybe you're thinking about changing your field and you're not sorry that you weren't dealing with blood being a medical doctor or another profession. Is there anybody here who's decided to change their profession in the future because of what we're seeing here today? Or are you all sticking with it? Has anybody dissuaded? Because we may be moving with all this government intervention and regulation. We may be moving from what we can deem as being capitalism to a form of socialism. I don't know. It may be the case. But when you lose money by doing the most prudent thing with your money, it makes you wonder. And since Halloween's right around the corner, it makes me think of the two guys who rented a truck, drove out into the country, and bought all the pumpkins they could buy. They bought them for $1 each, threw them into the truck, drove into the city, unloaded the pumpkins. My God, they sold out in 2 hours. One guy turns to the other, sold them for $1. They bought them for $1 and they sold them for $1. One guy turned to the other and said, "How did we do?" He said, "Well, we didn't make anything." And the other guy said, I told you we should have bought more. Buy more treasuries? Not sure that that's a recipe for success for the future. But how do you really approach a problem when you don't know what the problem is? And I talked about a move from capitalism to socialism. Definition. This, I wish I came up with this, but I didn't. The great Winston Churchill, you're all familiar with Winston Churchill, one of the great minds. He said the inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of misery. It's a great quote. You heard that quote? Oh, I thought you heard the quote. Yeah, great quote. Now, I don't know, because the case is being made now, and it's along political partisan lines, and I'll try to keep this as apolitical as I can, if I can help it. I'll try to keep it as apolitical as I can, as we're now seeing the curse of lack of appropriate overseeing, appropriate regulation, and there should be regulation. The New Deal saved capitalism from communism. Do we need a new deal? Do we need a new paradigm? I think it's safe to say that today's regulatory system and regulatory procedures aren't fit for today's system. But let's take a look at what's been going on. Has anybody here been watching the hearings today? Or have you all been? Anybody see any of the hearings? Well, this is great. I can tell you about it and take credit myself. I mean, it's fascinating because we're seeing a reaction that is bordering on desperation and panic. And I'm telling you, and I'll relate this to you as I give you some examples of some of the people, who I deal with from day to day. People come on my show like Steve Forbes and Jack Welch and Carly Fiorina, and I'll get to that too because I want to show you, Larry, that I'm pretty level-headed about politics, and I'm able to be critical of the other side as well. But I will get into that a little bit later. It's a frightening situation, and fear is driving this market. If you think about what's going on, we've all been rushed here, and I didn't know anything, but I kept saying on my radio shows, I wonder when the other shoe's going to drop. I wonder when the banks are going to start to collapse. When we're going to have a domino effect here, like we saw back in the savings and loan fiasco that we had back in the 70s with Charles Keating. And yes, I know that John McCain was involved with that. What are we looking at here? Well, here's what's scary. We're looking at a 3-page document that was hastily put together asking for $700 billion. I mean, $700 billion, that's what we're spending to send our energy overseas when you might be able to take $500 billion of that and put it into alternative energy here in the form of hydropower, electric power, coal, shale, nuclear power. It's absurd that we're not doing it. Every president has said, well, you know, it's going to take 5 years to do it. What the hell are they waiting for? We've got a monumental problem. But suddenly you got Henry Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and Christopher Cox saying we have an emergency situation. And I don't have any classified information, so I don't want anybody out there to think that I'm standing up here and I'm going to tell you something that I have some inside information. It isn't inside information. But do you know when these gentlemen talked before Congress just a couple of days ago, that Congress's reaction was almost panic? Was almost panic. That's how frightening this situation is. Or is it? And it's not just this. We have a combination of a lot of things going on. And here's how it all evolved. We had the irrational exuberance of the 90s, the buildup of the internet, the falsehood assuming that a 5,100 NASDAQ was a real number. We all know about that bubble. Called false positives. The crash of the stock market, and a lot of people got affected. I was one of them. I got caught up in investing in tech because it seemed like an sensible thing to do. And then suddenly we went right into the real estate boom. But do you know, and that's when the market collapsed as a result of this, a lot of it, and again, Professor Kotlikoff can tell you where the 13 increases in the federal funds rate in anticipation of an inflationary situation which didn't exist was the right thing to do. Was it?
Well, the interest rates were brought down very far, and then they were brought back up. So that had some impact on ginning up the housing market and then clamping it down.
Okay.
But prices were obviously inflated. Prices went up enormously. They're still 70% higher than they were in 2000. Oh, yeah, sorry. The prices today are still 70% higher than they were in 2000, even though they've come down perhaps 20% from about 18 months ago. They're still very high, so they still have a long way to go. And when they go down further, we'll be seeing more people walk away from these houses where the mortgage value exceeds the value of the house. That means more defaults or delinquencies, and that means a bigger default on these mortgage securities, which the banks are holding, and more problems, yeah.
The question is, when did you buy in? This is all great if you bought in 20 years ago and you can survive it. But what if you bought in, even if you were wealthy, and trust me when I tell you that people like Ed McMahon, Evander Holyfield, and others are losing their homes at a very high rate. This isn't just restricted to the middle class. It's a problem that was created by this subprime mortgage crisis that people like, I think, like Barney Frank, hypocrite, Christopher Dodd, Barney Frank, head of the Finance Committee in the Senate, Christopher Dodd, liberal senator from Connecticut. Gee, he didn't realize that he had some payments to make on his countrywide loan. It's amazing. It's amazing how politicians react and then turn it around. And now what they're looking to do is have redistribution of wealth in America. Do you really think it makes sense and that it's fair for somebody who has no money to be able to own a home and then assume a debt that they can never pay back? I'd love it as much as anybody to say, you see this bell-shaped curve? And you all know about that. It'd be really nice to take it and rearrange it. No longer are we going to have the bottom half. We're just going to have the upper half. It just doesn't work that way. Checks and balances in economics don't allow that to happen. You want a home, you put down 20%, you earn it, you're fine. They were just dying to give out money to anybody for redistribution of wealth And the fact that right now we're seeing a government-mandated program where you've got takeovers of AIG at about 79% of ownership there. We saw what happened with Lehman Brothers. The only reason Lehman Brothers wasn't saved, two reasons. Number one, a lot of those assets were illiquid, and they're being purchased from foreign entities who we're really getting further in debt with. You've got Merrill Lynch. I mean, these are solid institutions. Who would have ever thought? Now you got Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, who instead of becoming institutional banks they're going to become they're traditional banks, all with approval. So how far do we go in terms of mandating and regulation in society today? You want everything regulated? There's talk from a lot of the political partisans, and this is a problem, and I think it comes down to fiduciary responsibility here, about having caps on salaries of CEOs in corporations. We've already got problems in corporations because of the fact that publicly traded companies have their hands tied behind their backs because of what they have to go through with Sarbanes-Oxley. The fees that they have to pay, the scrutinies that they're under, and the compliance that they have to accommodate are making a terrible situation for these companies who are operating in a really, really tight squeeze. Do you really want government owning everything and telling you what to do? Ronald Reagan said government was the problem. It isn't the solution. Does this mean that there shouldn't be any government? Government has a role, but government shouldn't force itself into the private lives of each and every individual and have you pay the consequences. And I see, you know what the rationale is? The rationale for what we're looking at right now with this bailout is the government will assume the debt. They'll buy it at what's called a reverse auction. I guess it's the lowest price instead of the highest price, where they may buy these assets that are no darn good at 20 and 30 cents on the dollar. And unlike a business, unlike a corporation, they can hold on to these assets until the value of the assets goes up. What happens if the value of the assets don't go up? I know we've had a history of the housing market coming back and continuing to accelerate and appreciate in price, but what if it doesn't? Are you prepared to see $700 billion of your money? Remember now, 4% of the people in this country are in default. And you know what that $700 billion comes to? It's about $3,600 for a taxpayer. And you know what the rationale is? Taxpayer costs to cover this. And that's just a guess, because we don't know whether it's $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion. I mean, what's the difference between 1 and 2 trillion? You know how big a trillion is? Well, the cost of this, if you go back, excuse me, I tried to kick this before I came in, but I couldn't. The cost to the taxpayer, $150 billion for the savings and loan, $50 billion for the Great Depression. But if you prorate that $50 billion, it's pretty much tantamount to this for $500 billion when you had 7,000 banks failing. Do you know how many banks you have failing right now? Here's the problem. Nobody knows who owes who what. Nobody knows what the value of these assets are, or whether they'll ever resurrect their value. And nobody will ever knows how much debt we have incurred and what we're going to be able to do about it. It's a very frightening situation. And it's in the hands right now of, just for purposes of simplicity, Ben Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, Henry Paulson, and Christopher Cox. Most of these people who aren't going to have to worry about their future and their savings. But I want to go back to the irrational exuberance of the 90s, and I want to move forward to the housing crisis. I got off track there, my apologies. Do you know that with $9 trillion lost in the stock market, 2000 to 2002, do you know the amounts that were gained in the real estate market? They exceeded $9 trillion. So what happened in this continuum, in this evolution of events? We went from irrational exuberance and Y2K, you know, all the problems about what are we going to do when we hit the year 2000. It was never a problem. I didn't know it was going to be a problem. I said spend the money. And then we roll right along to the real estate crisis, to the real estate boom. Then suddenly, when we come out of that, consumer confidence has to carry this economy. When the consumer couldn't carry it anymore because of oppression and being stifled with increasing costs at the gas pump, trying to pay a mortgage, salaries not being commensurate with the increase, with wage increases not being commensurate with the cost of living, the corporations took over. The corporations took over flush with cash, flush with cash, not knowing what to do with it, investing in their infrastructure. The only reason they didn't spend the money is because out of fear. It's like saying, if you have the IBM mainframe, should I should I stay with the mainframe or should I develop new technology? I'm running into the fear right now that if I spend the money for new technology, it's going to be outdated in a matter of weeks or months. So there was restraint. And we had a recession, an inverted recession with capacity and demand. That was different than in this last recession. This one here, we're technically not in a recession, by the way. I'm going to tell you why in a moment. I mean, we're not. We haven't had two consecutive quarters of negative growth. Consumer, the corporations, back to the consumer, where are we now? We're in the scariest position we've ever been. Because if you believe in big government, you've got your wish. Government right now is going to be at the controls of all of these corporations. All of these entities. They'll never exist the way they ever existed before. Wall Street won't exist like it existed before. I understand why AIG was saved, and there's a rationale for it. The intellectual response is you had to save AIG as the largest insurance company that had its tentacles spread into about 100 countries. And you know what the collapse would have been? It would have been monumental. I understand why the $85 billion was spent there and the $25 billion was put into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie and Freddie. It's beyond comprehension. Nobody knew who was doing what with Fannie and Freddie. And when you get into the politics of it, Franklin Raines, who was the CEO who walked away with $100 million, they were the largest, I think the largest person who donated to Chris Dodd and Barack Obama. I mean, there are so many conflicting stories here, and there are so many people with hands in other people's pockets that you almost have to decide what the rationale for doing this was. And here's where the illogic comes into it. Lehman Brothers was not saved because of the timing. I believe if this were another week or two, they would have found another, I don't know, 20 or 30 billion to save Lehman Brothers. But they felt they had to pull the trigger because there were illiquid assets in letting Lehman Brothers go. So who stays and who survives and who doesn't? Who's in charge of making these dramatic decisions? There are other entities and there are other reasons that we're dealing with a situation like this. And by the way, you people, especially those of you who are majoring in economics, should really pay close attention to this, because you will eventually be a decision maker in terms of what happens, or at least have a voice if we indeed have a voice left. It's a scary, scary time, and we're seeing all of this come up. Gee, isn't it coincidental that there's an election? It's very funny that there's an election coming up in November, and I wonder how much of this has been timed. No, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't know that it's been timed, but someone called in my show the other morning and said, Stu, did you ever think that this was a deliberate attempt on the part of the Democrats to get this information out? And I was sort of reserved, and I said, I think the timing would have been better in October. You know, the October surprise, because Americans have a very short attention span. It's like a fad, which is a cultural phenomenon that captivates the imagination of millions of people over a short period of time. It has no pragmatic advantage to it, and then suddenly it just dies. It's the same thing. We're a country that moves at such a fast pace, a country that has 5% of the world's population, and because we're a consumption society, which isn't all that bad, unless you believe that greed is bad, greed misused is bad, I think you've got to reform the definition. 5% of the world's population, 30% of the GDP. So let's take the opposite position. We'll get back to the politics in a second, but I never seem to get to this point that I want to get to. Are we in a recession? Smells like a recession. Gee, it feels like a recession. I don't have any problem getting in certain places, but hotels are pretty booked, restaurants are pretty filled. Is it just that I'm hanging around with the right people? Well, we're going to have a 3.3% GDP. Even though we've had 600,000 layoffs since January, we got a 6.1% unemployment rate. Yeah, it may go up to 7, but for those who weren't around in the dreaded 70s, what did it go to 17%?
Not unemployment, no.
I mean, I'm sorry, it went to 8 or 9?
Yeah, it might have been.
Yeah, the interest rates went way up, but unemployment.
Interest rates got up to 20%. 7%, yeah.
But 6.1% full employment is constituted as 95% is full employment. It's not that bad. GDP, you can if you can get money and you can borrow it, it's at a low rate. But here's the real thing that scares me. What really scares me is that this problem on Wall Street, if anybody invested in the market? You're losing money right now, or you're too sick to look? Market's not doing that badly. I mean, when you think about it, not yet. Anything over 10,000 right now, a bear market is described in anything that's 20% off the market. Yeah, we're in a bear market. I don't know if we're in a recession. It depends who you are. Some people are in a recession and others aren't. But if you look at Wall Street right now, it's holding its own. So when John McCain idiotically made the statement, God, I wish I could do some PR for some of these politicians. John McCain came on and said, well, fundamentally, the fundamentals of the economy are sound. He was actually right, I think, but that was an awfully stupid thing to say when everybody's scared out of their wits. And then he tried to modify the statement, and he said, well, what I mean is I have confidence and faith in the American people, and they're fundamentally sound. Well, that was a little bit brainless. And then he said, I don't support the bailout of any of these companies. And then the next morning he came back and he said, I support the bailout of AIG.
Got a question?
Yeah.
Like, as an individual, why do I care if the bank goes out of business?
If who goes out of business?
Why do I care if the bank goes away?
So here's the question. As an individual, why do I care if a bank goes out of business?
Merrill Lynch stock, frankly,
I don't know when it own.
bunch of bad mistakes, and now they're gone.
Right. Why do I care if Merrill Lynch goes out of business since I don't own their stock? Why should I care?
Well, I'll tell you why you care, because you may find out that that if this sets off a chain reaction, and suddenly the funds aren't there from the FDIC to cover your $100,000 or less, and you're insured up to $100,000. I've never understood, even as a kid, why anyone would have more than $100,000 in an account. If that domino affects the spreads, and people are pulling their money out of the banks, and suddenly there's no reimbursement for the government because there's no money to pay you back, you may care. I'm not asking you to be a patriot. Look at it from your own selfish, greedy point of view. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's okay. I mean, I do too, and I do things sometimes that I'm ashamed of. I was out with someone who I mentioned to you in your office, I won't mention. I have a friend who's in comedy. He's one of the premier comics around. And he said to me the other night in New York at dinner, he said, do you ever find yourself in an elevator? This has nothing to do with this talk. Ever find yourself in an elevator and you see somebody coming in, you press the button, you pretend you don't see him, and you close the door? I said, yeah, you know something? I do. And then he asked the person, there were three of us eating, and he asked the other, oh no, I'd never do that. And he said, you're a blankety blank liar. I just want to ask you, do you close the elevator door if you see someone coming in? Be honest.
Who they are.
Depends on who they are. Yeah.
I mean, so you should care. I mean, you really, really should care. Now, there are other events that are controlling all of this. Things that Professor Kotlikoff is much more eloquent at talking about than I am, but I think I can list some of these thoughts. It's the dilution of ethics in a society where the temptations can be awfully great, whether they're social or whether they're economic or whether they're just power-driven. It's difficult sometimes to resist the temptation. I've always found myself resisting the temptation, mainly because I'm like my father, I guess. I just want to be able to go to sleep at night and get up and talk this fast and not have to worry about covering up my statements. So you have the dilution. You have the lack of corporate governments and fiduciary responsibility. You have this whole new global society where you can come up with the rationale that maybe we're not in trouble because Saudi Arabia and Japan and Germany, all these countries who are so heavily invested in us, don't really want us to fail, because it'll mean that they'll fail financially. And if you believe that terrorism isn't the biggest threat in the world, but the biggest threat really is based upon economics, the rest of the world has suddenly come to their senses that most wars today, not the big one we're fighting today, will be won economically, just like it was won against Russia, the once mighty USSR. And that for many of you out there, and I won't make this political, who disdain the Bush administration, and with all the things that Bush has done wrong, this Democrat Congress and this liberal media have been so bent on the hatred for George Bush that they've been unable really to look at things from an objective standpoint. But we've allied, but I'll tell you what George Bush has done. He's allied our country with India to form an alliance to offset the potential relationship with China and Russia. It's a great move, and I don't know what his legacy will be 20 or 30 years down the road. And I'm really not here to discuss the Iraq War or ideology, but I will say that the emotions are so high. I had a bitter argument. Anybody familiar with Jonathan Alter of Newsweek? He's a senior editor, and he's been on my show several times. And he was on about 5 or 6 months ago. The only time I'll have a confrontation is if I'm attacked. I'm always diplomatic and always cordial. And all of my guests, if I may toot my horn, will always say, thank you for letting me express my opinion. The only reason I'm not letting you express your opinion is I'm here to talk and you're here to listen, but I do welcome you to ask any questions, and that was a good one as well. I love that honesty. Jonathan Alter, I had told Jonathan Alter that certain members of this Congress, on a subconscious level, are so bent upon and so desperate for us to lose this war in order to bury George Bush that they've completely foregone their patriotism. I know we'll be talking about that at coffee someday. And he attacked me and said, how dare you to say that? And I said, Jonathan, I don't think you heard exactly what I said. And I said basically the key word there was perhaps on a subconscious level, because, I mean, why would I ever think that any of these disgusting politicians would put themselves and their own private lobbying effects ahead of the country? Another subject for another time. I'll be back here next week to talk about that. But also, if you look at this global market, we're looking at dynamics that we're yet to understand. And the United States system, monetary and financial system, and I'll leave that to Professor Kotlikoff to elaborate, since I'm not capable enough to do it, how if we keep going in the direction we're going to do, we're going to emulate the EU and the European model of how their financial system is set up. That'd be a good topic in class. Also, we're looking at, if you look at history, and some people believe that you look at the cyclical effects of history, how history will repeat itself in a different form, how we keep making the same mistakes with different people and with different technology. And the integration, the inextricable integration of technology with human behavior, with the human element, has created conditions that we're unable to totally fathom yet. And I talked about the fact that history repeats itself, and if you look at cycles, except here's what scares me. Is history going to repeat itself right now? Are we really headed for a Great Depression? And can we really afford to make a move, as I get back to the Federal Reserve, as I get back to the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Paulson, and the head of the SEC, Christopher Cox? How scary is it, which is the basis of this decision, to come up with a conclusion based upon some rapid moves because we're afraid of the consequences by not allocating $700 billion to $1 trillion? The comeback is, once we sell it, I said this before, once the government owns these assets, and do you think they'll want to own everything? And do you think we'll be giving out free housing if Barney Frank has his way to give out free houses for everyone?
That's unfair.
Of course it's fair.
I said it's unfair, your comments.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think it's unfair. I think it's a point of view.
It's not fair, I'm saying.
Well, I think it's a point of view, and some people share that point of view. He's on that committee right now, coming back and being critical of all of those who are responsible for this, when he deserves at least as much equal blame. But yes.
Well, so you alluded to this a couple of times about Barney Frank and some of the congressmen causing some of the crisis by pushing to make subprime mortgages available. Having worked briefly with a mortgage company, what I saw there was very, very little of the subprime loans were done for HMDA compliance or regulatory reasons, that there's a little bit of that going on from fair lending, but the vast majority was driven by profit seeking because the margins were so low on regular mortgages. But how much of the subprime mortgages do you believe was caused by legislative efforts to make loans available?
I think enough so that it's significant. I couldn't even begin to give you a percentage. I think it's a very real issue, but I think it's part of this whole process right now that everybody is going through with trying to decide where the problem lies, what kind of dollars are up here for grabs, where the responsibility lies. And the responsibility is widespread. There isn't any question about it. Everybody should assume responsibility for this. Even those people who were successful enough to go out and make huge sums of money and then decided they could buy 3 or 4 or 5 homes and now can't support it because they don't have the income to support it, or the credit crunch is so substantial that they can't sustain themselves. I mean, I can't answer that question beyond that unless you can, Larry.
Well, let me give you a chance to have a sip of water here and just kind of provide a little bit of background here for this whole discussion. So what's been going on here is that the government has in some ways encouraged people to get into homes who really couldn't necessarily afford the down payment. And rather than give them the down payment, they said, well, it's okay for companies to lend on either a 0 down payment or a 5% down payment, and to even allow people to borrow at very low interest rates initially and then higher interest rates later. And some of this was done through the federal home loan banks and Fannie and Freddie Mae, which ultimately ended up buying up some of these what are called subprime mortgages. So the banks a little bit got into this business, but then it was in large part being done by investment companies, and Merrill Lynch was an example of where they thought, gee, we're going to be charging high interest. Maybe in the short run these interest rates will be low, but eventually they'll be high after the teaser rates are done and the higher rates kick in on these mortgages. So they started selling a lot of this stuff. They packaged it together, and then they decided to do some financial innovation on these packages of mortgages where they would sell kind of claims to with higher probability of repayment to some part of the stream of repayments on this packages of mortgages. And then that was the top tranche of these mortgage-backed securities, and then there was a second tranche and a third tranche. So they created new products without any real oversight by Washington, because in some part Washington, both the Republicans and the Democrats, I don't think Barney Frank bears any more responsibility than John McCain for this, to tell you the truth, or maybe or any less really, but they the banks were not the banks that were kind of regulated by the federal government and by state agencies weren't the big players here. It was the unregulated financial enterprises like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch. They all got into this game. Mortgage companies like Countrywide, and then they started selling these securities, which are pretty exotic, to pension funds, and the pension funds wanted to have insurance, so they got different insurance companies to ensure that these mortgages would actually get paid off. And AIG is one of these big insurance companies that did some of that insuring, and you had some other companies called monoline insurers. So everybody kind of got involved in this game where they, you know, and the typical story would be you issue a mortgage to somebody who really can't afford it. You don't document it very well. You package it with a bunch of other mortgages that are not necessarily going to be repaid, but you kind of pretend that they are, or that they're decent. And then you might sell this stuff to a third party, and then that third party might seek insurance, and that from a fourth party, and this fourth party might say, okay, we'll cover you, but then they might take the premiums for that insurance and go invest it in something else that was risky. So you have this intertangling of obligations here. And the interesting thing about this is, to an economist, is that companies like, whether it be AIG, which is the biggest insurance company in the world, or Merrill Lynch, which is no longer what it was a few weeks ago because it was absorbed by Bank of America, or Lehman Brothers, which is now gone bankrupt, or Bear Stearns, which has really been absorbed by J.P. Morgan, or Fannie or Mae or Freddie Mac, which were quasi-governmental institutions. They acquired these assets. They borrowed money to buy at low rates to buy the stuff that was yielding potentially high rates. They got some insurance, and then they failed to tell the public what exactly they held. So we have these big institutions holding hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions, who knows, of assets and also obligations, and you can't go onto the internet and find out exactly who has what. Right. And so consequently, there's this same kind of situation we had in the 30s, and I'm going to give this back to you in a second, that nobody trusted the banks because nobody knew who the banks had made loans to. So you'd put your money into a bank in 1930 or maybe 1928, and here you are, it's 1930, and some of the banks had failed, and you couldn't trust your local bank because you didn't know who they'd lent the money to and whether that person would repay, and therefore whether you'd be able to get your checking account money back out. And that's why there was a run on the bank, and a third of the banks failed before 1933, where Roosevelt came in, shut the banks down for a week, opened them up again, and said the government is now going to insure these deposits. And we're going to guarantee that you're not going to lose money. And that stopped the bank runs. And we had no runs on any major bank since then that was insured by the federal government. The federal government's in that same kind of situation right now where we have these institutions, people don't trust them, and they're kind of thinking about grabbing their money out, selling their stocks of these companies, if they have money market accounts with these companies, pulling that money out. And that could lead the different institutions to become insolvent and the whole financial structure to go under. Just like you had a third of the banks fail back in the 30s, early 30s, you could have we already have big institutions fail. We could have lots of smaller institutions fail as well. And then people wouldn't be able to borrow money. Businesses wouldn't be able to kind of borrow some money to try and hire you guys to to pay you to try and produce something to try and sell at the end of the day. And that's how you can have the whole thing cycle down and lead to a big recession, if not a continued recession or a series of recessions, which is called a depression. And that's what happened in the 30s. And that's what Secretary Paulson and Ben Bernanke are trying to avoid, that kind of ratcheting down of the entire structure. Now, and they're proposing, after having basically taken over AIG, taken over Fannie and Freddie, supervised the takeover of Merrill Lynch, allowed Bear Stearns to be taken over by J.P. Morgan, supervised that, and watched Lehman Brothers fail. They've decided they have to try and come up with $700 billion to try and buy up these securities that nobody really knows how much there are, isn't any, how much of these things are in any particular institution, and they're somewhat exotic. They weren't being sold in very thick markets. They were being sold between people over the counter in individual deals. So you have enormous volume of this stuff, and it's just not clear who owns what and how you can actually value it. So when Stu here is raising the questions of whether the government, he's a Republican. He's not a Republican. He's kind of off to the right. He's a libertarian, whatever we want to call him. He's got a political position, but
I'm not a journalist.
He's not a journalist, but regardless of who you said caused this, I think there's lots of culprits. There's a question of what we should do now. And Stu is saying, gee, we have lots of problems. The country's basically financially in tough shape because of the fact that we've got 78 million baby boomers about to retire and get paid about $50,000 a head for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits. Nobody's talking about that problem. That's the big problem out there. And we've got environmental problems. We've got a lot of stuff going on. We've already spent a lot of money on this financial mess. And maybe we're overdoing it. Maybe we should let the markets kind of take care of themselves.
As Doug Casey would say.
Yeah, maybe if we had some more failures, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Maybe we should stop worrying about 1930 and let's just stay out of this because the government can't afford it. And the government, if it tries to commit to too much, it may have to just start printing money like crazy to pay these obligations, which means we're going to have prices go up like crazy and have hyperinflation. That's going to put us into the situation of Zimbabwe, where the inflation rate now...
stagflation.
Yeah. So we're very high inflation and also very low employment
Low
and
growth.
a recession.
Yep.
So this is the context of this discussion. Should we now, having done what we've done at the federal government level, come in and take $700 billion of taxpayer money, buy up these securities that are very exotic, that nobody can value too well, and potentially overpay for them, and have the taxpayer, we're buying up assets for the $700 billion. You get something back at some point in the future. If Joe Schmo actually repays his mortgage, we'll get a lot back. If he doesn't, we won't get paid back. And so we're putting the taxpayer at risk, and that means we're putting all of us at risk. And who are we helping here? Well, it's the stockholders of the banks who would be, if we overpay for these assets, it's the owners of the banks who would be helped. And some of those people are us as well, because some of us own stock. So it's a pretty confused, complicated situation. I'm going to give it back to Stu. He's going to tell us what to do here.
And everything he said, for my money, is right on target. I would love to see a bipartisan solution to this, a real, true bipartisan solution where the American people are put ahead of the political agenda. Unfortunately, it's not really true. So if I go to you and I want a mortgage, and you grant me the mortgage, you're on the hook. Then you turn around and you sell that mortgage, and when that mortgage gets resold and resold, all hell can break loose. There are no restrictions. You can do whatever you want. The only one on the line for it is you on that first sale on the mortgage.
And if I didn't have to put any down payment down, why do I can just walk away with it from it. So the big problem here, I think, and I'm not going to be political here, was the fact that this whole move to deregulate was a big mistake, because one of the regulations we should have had was that you have to have a 20% down payment, that you can't have lend to people who can't repay and pretend they can repay, and then give them low rates, teaser rates. That's fraud. And we had the federal government buying up basically participating in that kind of consumer fraud. And both parties were saying, well, gee, we're going to get more homeowners, and this is going to help poor people. To some extent, the Democrats said that will help poor people get into houses. If you wanted to help poor people get into houses, give them the down payment and let them buy their house so that they know that 20% of that house belongs to them. Don't say, well, gee, we're going to change the regulations so that you can buy the house for nothing.
Right.
That's what the Congress did, and it was partly the Democrats and partly the Republicans were involved in that whole game.
No disagreement.
Good. Let John get in. John's
just one quick issue about Fannie and Freddie are somewhat different on this. About the definition of what subprime is, that were mortgages that were of a quality such that Freddie and Fannie would not hold them.
Right.
So you have, yes, there's a lot of money going in securitization, but the really lousy stuff in the, would you say, semi-fraud was outside of Fannie and Freddie.
Yeah, but they're holding half of all the mortgages. One way or another, they're responsible
one correction
for
to
half
that,
mortgages.
John. I thought that too, that Freddie and Fannie were restricted from buying up these subprimes, but that I subsequently recently found out that wasn't the case. That Freddie actually has a good chunk of its portfolio. One of the reasons that they got into trouble was that they actually have a good chunk of assets that are these subprimes that they ended up holding. And again, that nobody knows quite the value of. So everybody decided, well, maybe these companies that are the biggest mortgage companies really in the world, maybe they've got crap on their books, because we can't tell what it is. It's just like a bank in the 30s. We can't tell whether this bank's made a loan to a good farmer or a bad farmer, right? So we'll just say, screw it, we're going to take our money out, which involves selling stock. And then the value of these stocks went to zero, and the government said, gee, we can't have Fannie and Freddie owes all this money to these other companies. If they don't repay these other companies, those companies are going to go under, or those other financial institutions are going to go under. So that's where the federal government came in. So that's what I thought too, but they actually were holding.
Good point. Good point.
Yep.
Got lots of foreclosures.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this.
And then, Fannie and Freddie got into trouble too, because people were walking away from the regular mortgages, the non-subprime mortgages, but we could overstate this. We're not in the 30s. We don't have 20% unemployment, which is what we did have in the 30s, I believe. 25. Yeah, it was very high. We don't have a third of the only about 11 banks have closed, and they've been reorganized. We do have FDIC insurance.
It's 700 plus banks right now that are teetering.
Yeah. So And we have seen big problems in the, we saw the crash in the 2000. In 87, we saw a big crash. We saw the S&L crisis, which was somewhat similar in the 80s. So we've seen a lot of financial problems, and the country has been very robust and survived it. So we could easily overstate what's happening, and that's part of what Stu is saying here. We might be getting too concerned and therefore putting too much of taxpayers' money at risk here and obligating ourselves beyond what's reasonable.
But I'm saying they don't know, and I don't know, and that's the scary part of this, that we don't know. But we're talking about, you talk about the greed, you talk about the fraud in the market today. Let's go back to what I sometimes deem as a pragmatic solution rather than an ideological solution. Tyco, Dennis Kozlowski, Enron, Imclone, WorldCom. We all remember what happened? You weren't too young to remember what happened in 2000, 2001, and all of these companies, which are actually represented not a huge portion of the corporate world, but it's almost like having one little mole of cancer. If you have a drop of melanoma, you're a cancer patient. You have cancer. So the perception for the American public, and we can't lose the confidence in our financial markets. We can't lose the confidence in the American people. So there was a very pragmatic solution to what happened with Sarbanes-Oxley, because there were tons of inside traders who could have been nailed with everything that went on. I mean, you can't even imagine what went on. Many more corporations. Our financial institutions, do you think they were innocent? Merrill Lynch was slapped with $1 million fine. But reason and practicality superseded ideology and, in a sense, moral or an ethical solution to the problem. If the government and the SEC and the Justice Department went after all of those people, I mean, I know Martha Stewart was a case and she was used as a figurehead. I mean, she was used as an example, just like Rock Hudson, who died many years ago, was an example of what we had to do to treat AIDS. When a high-profile figure is involved, it attracts attention and it sends out an alarm. Boy, if they're going after Martha Stewart, I'd better watch out. So what could have the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Justice Department, and the government done? They could have gone after everybody. Everybody. And you know why they didn't? Does anybody have an answer? And I'll tell you why they didn't. Let me tell you why they didn't. I can't even wait for the answer. The reason that they didn't was because they would have destroyed the confidence of the American public, and everybody would have pulled their money out. They wouldn't have invested in any companies or any things. So they came to what is a logical conclusion. Like, we sent out the message, anybody committing these crimes in the future will be persecuted and prosecuted, indicted and convicted and sentenced in the future. I don't know how much it solved the problem. There'll be a new form of crime. All these crimes evolve depending upon, especially with our new computer and internet technology. I'm not saying crime will be eradicated, but it sent a message to the American people that you can trust in our country and you can trust in our system and you can invest in America. John Grasso, head of the New York Stock Exchange, who walked away with $142 billion in a settlement. Elliot Spitzer had gone after him. He was kind of the symbol of what it means to support Wall Street and stay ahead of it. It doesn't mean to support everybody on it. But you can't lose faith in your country and you can't lose faith in your system. As far as CEO salaries go, and corporate salaries, let me be critical of the Republican nominee, just to show you how even-tempered I am. Let me tell you that Carly Fiorina, who was a great guest on my show, very gracious. You all know she was the CEO of Hewlett-Packard and walked away with a $42 million severance package. That John McCain can't figure out how to answer why when he talks about reform. This is what I mean about being objective. I mean, John McCain is terrible at handling these questions. He's great if you sit him down in the right environment and he's talking about our military effort. He's terrific. But he can't answer any of these questions. All I know is this, and I ain't no genius, but if I were running for president, I would have sat down with my team and I would have said, how do I answer the question about why Carly Fiorina is one of my advisors and I'm criticizing these huge corporate salaries that people are walking away with these tremendous packages?
And she walked away with $42 million.
$42 million. Right. And then she comes out with the most
having wrecked Hewlett-Packard.
Yeah, right. With one of the most idiotic of all statements. Whether it's true or not, there are some things you don't say in politics. You know, I have a chapter in my book. My book is How to Turn Trends into Fortunes. The only lie that will ever net you $1 is the lie you don't tell. I'm really never afraid of getting trapped in a lie. I'm too afraid to lie. I'm afraid. Yeah. Don't lie. Carly Fiorina should have said nothing. She told the truth. She got up and said that Barack Obama, Joe Biden, John McCain, and Sarah Palin are incapable of running a company. And running a company, and we've seen this debate in terms of Sarah Palin's qualifications versus Barack Obama's, come to your own conclusion. That's not where I'm going. Why would you come out with a statement when you're a chief spokesperson for someone running for president and say they're incapable of running a company? Or why, if you were Phil Gramm, come out and say that the American people are people who whine? But these politicians are up there. Barack Obama's talked about it with guns and religion. They all make mistakes. Some mistakes are really much bigger than others. Carly Fiorina's mistake was almost unforgivable. McCain hasn't figured out how to answer a lot of these questions because he has had an opportunity to gain a lot of ground. And, you know, there's a lot that's going to happen between now and November, and watch out for the October surprise. I don't know what it is or where it'll be coming from, but just remember one thing, and I guess this is on video, so I'm on record. There will be an October surprise. I think I know what it's going to be, but I really don't want to say it. And I don't have any inside information, but watch what happens in October, and I think you may be stunned.
What's your, give us a prediction.
You know, Larry, if I did that, I may come in here and alienate a lot of the people sitting here. And I think you and I, we discussed this for an hour. I'm going to pass on that. Okay. I really want to pick, because I'm not here. Originally, I wanted to come in and I wanted to talk about politics. And John would have walked out probably in 5 minutes, but that's okay. I'm not a journalist. I have a point of opinion, and I never disguise it or fake it. And I won't back down from a position. But what does that mean for you? It means that there are a ton of opportunities out there. I mean, there are so many opportunities, and you just have to navigate the waters and find out what they are. Who said it? Wasn't Somerset Maugham? George Bernard Shaw said, the people who succeed in life are those who take advantage of the opportunities at hand, and when they don't exist, they create them. I know you're probably saying, what the hell is he talking about? But I will tell you that like a team, like a football team that has a lot of holes and gaps, and the Patriots are one of them in this past weekend, generally teams that people who are weak, and if I can use the analogy to football, use trick plays and blitzes in order to overcome their deficiencies. If you can find out where there's an opening in life, or if you can use your strengths, I'm telling you, those opportunities can come along. I'm not here to talk about my career and having capitalized on a number of opportunities that have come out, but be aware of what people say and what they hear out there. So here's an example of someone who found an opportunity. Anybody ever hear about the verger at St. Stephen's Church? You know about that one. Isn't that great?
Great story.
It's a great story. Well, this verger, really wish you didn't hear it. It takes away a little of the energy, but pretend you didn't hear it. It's a great story. He worked at St. Stephen's Church. He helped out in the parish. He did all the things he was supposed to do. Guy couldn't read or write. And after 20 years, can you believe it, in this cruel society, they let him go. They let him go. So he walked out into the street in this little area, and he lit up a cigarette and another cigarette, and pretty soon he was out of cigarettes. And he walked around, and he couldn't find a tobacco store. And suddenly he saw an opportunity. And he bought a tobacco store, and it was successful. And he bought another one, and another one, and another one. And guess what? This lonely, introverted verger at St. Stephen's Church became a huge, huge financial success. So successful that he needed to borrow money. And one day he went to a bank, and the banker came out and he said, you know, my business is so good, I think I'm going to have to finance the business in order to expand. The banker turned to him and said, hey, all you have to do is just read these contracts and sign them. The verger looks up at him and says, excuse me, you know, I'm awfully sorry, I can't read or write. The banker says, you're telling me you own all these tobacco stores? You can't read or write? Do you have any idea where you'd be today if you could read or write? he says, yes, I do, sir. I'd be the verger at St. Stephen's Church. It's a great lesson in life how you can take advantage of those opportunities. How much time do I have? Should we open it to questions?
Why don't we stop and get some questions? Yeah.
Okay, if there are any, and I said this before we started, if any of these questions are technical in nature, I'm not an economist, I'm not an analyst, and I'm not a financial planner. I have no problems for Professor
I'll
Kotlikov
answer,
answering
yeah.
them.
Okay, let's see who has questions about anything about the current economic financial crisis, or non-crisis that we're facing.
Anything. It can be on opportunities in life. It can be on.
Yes, go right ahead. You make the question. I'll repeat it.
Okay. You kept talking about the American consumer confidence.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, isn't that what got us into this place in the first place?
Well, you're taking the definition of confidence and attaching an accentuated elaboration of what confidence means. There's a difference between having confidence and having reckless behavior and reckless abandon and making decisions predicated on all the successes you've had in the past. There's nothing wrong with having confidence. And, I'd rather be on the outside looking in than on the inside trying to get out. There's nothing wrong with having confidence, and consumer confidence is justifiably based upon two things: the dynamics going on in the economy and one's own personal portfolio or behavior. I have a neighbor around the corner who her husband, she's still a friend of mine. She's remarried, has got a great marriage. Her husband, he abandoned her years ago. She put him through college. She joined National Organization of Women. That's her perspective. That's where she gathers her strength. Her confidence level is based upon what has environmentally affected her in her life, either financially or socially or culturally. You may have difficulty having consumer confidence if you've been victimized and lost 90% of your assets, or have been forced to live on the street, as you see so many homeless people. You can't lose confidence, but don't take the definition and take it out of context. You can have caution, you can be cautious. You've heard about people who are cautiously optimistic. Try to remain cool, calm, and collected in the heat of battle, and walk 4 squares, shoulder to shoulder, one step at a time. Anybody else?
Okay. Yes.
What should we as students be doing right now in this situation?
Financially, in terms of investment, do you have, or looking for the future, towards the future? Looking.
We're studying economics and business. It's like kind of a weak area to be in right now.
You're talking about for a future vocation? I would not abandon, I would first ask yourself, and I know this sounds awfully corny and it sounds canned, I cannot tell you how much of this is from here. Don't give up on anything that you see, and I wasn't trying to discourage anyone by saying how many of you changed your minds and based upon what you're seeing taking place on Wall Street. If that's really a desire, and that's really what you want, you can find a satisfactory path to where you're going. Let me give you an example. My younger daughter just recently got her master's degree in organic chemistry at Northwestern. And her goal was to go on for a PhD in organic chemistry. I know she's my daughter. She happens to be beautiful and talented, and so she's everything my wife is. She called one day, and she had her PhD program all taken care of at Northwestern, and said, Dad, are you sitting? And I actually, when it's your kid, I says, oh yeah, this is no problem, honey. What do you want to tell me? I was almost shaking, thinking, are you sitting? She said, are you going to be upset if I don't go on for my PhD? I said, oh, no, not at all. What do you have in mind? I know she thought about going on to business school. And the reason she didn't want to go on for her PhD was being young and bright and beautiful and 24. She didn't want to end up being in a lab 12 hours a day, 6 days a week till she was 29 to get a PhD, because she thought she would lose some opportunities to balance her life. And you should really look for the track in life you want. It's so important to, I know it's hard, it may be a little difficult to do now. You want to go on a track to have a family. A lot of that will factor into what you do, but you should get your feet wet early on. Oh, by the way, the end of the story is, without even me knowing, she said she sent out applications to financial firms and got hired by a great wealth management firm in downtown Chicago. In fact, I'm going to visit, my wife and I are going to visit her on Friday. And she's in love with it. And she's an analyst for them. She'll be out in consulting, and she's now planning to go on for her MBA. She didn't want to do that, and yet she had those natural feelings about, would she disappoint me? Would she disappoint my wife? It's always difficult for a parent to be in that situation. I totally and 100% endorsed her move, and I would have endorsed her move if she said she was going to go on for a PhD. You've got to follow your heart and not be affected by these events, because there will be new circumstances created. And I don't know if you were looking for something at Goldman Sachs or in that field, and you may not know yourself. But ask yourself one real question. Obviously, you have the intellectual capability and capacity, or you wouldn't be here. Ask yourself this real question. Do I really love it? Because if you want to do something that's just monetarily based, my advice to people is don't do it. You know, I would die to be your age right now, to be able to take advantage of all these opportunities out there. With new technology, with new career openings everywhere. I think of Applied Materials in Texas. What they do is they have their own staff basically fire themselves and reinvent their jobs at increases to encourage creativity. There are a million things you can do out there today. If you love it, do it. And you know something? Here's the other thing. You're not under any pressure to make a decision. What year are you in? It's good that but you know, it's really good that you're thinking about it right now. Don't let these events of this week influence you. It was kind of tongue-in-cheek when I talked about blood on the street. I mean, there is blood on the street. Stay with your passion.
In other words, major in economics. Let's see, any more questions? Yeah, in the back. Sir.
When you said, you mentioned the cyclical nature of history.
Yeah.
Just a quick okay, history. Which great superpower will have to collapse? Soviet Union. Why? Because a huge influx of deregulation and the lack of regulation, like the 20% deposits, and looking at the situation right now.
Of the 20% what?
Of the 20% down payment, on mortgages and that. What happened to the Soviet Union? We all know, I think. And that made me think about, I mean, if nature, if history, as you said before, is really cyclical, what might be happening to the system we live in, considering like all these huge powers are, their populations are actually growing, our GDP is going down. I mean, I'd just like to know your opinion on that.
I wish I knew. I can tell you what I fear. And just for simplistic purposes, without elaborating on it, I fear government control. I fear regulation that's gone beyond what sane, reasonable regulatory measures should be. There should be some regulation. We shouldn't have haphazard behavior where people can go out and trample on this system and take advantage by oppressing others. But my great fear, as I look at the government takeover and the percentage of ownership, is pretty soon we're going to be nationalized in that sense, and we may be going too far. And it looks like that there has been we don't know if this is going to get approved yet. It's a real concern, and even with my somewhat libertarian philosophy, certainly a conservative philosophy, I'm just like anybody else. I mean, I'm sitting here saying, you know, I'm really worried about this. And if we have to have the regulation set in to save the system, it's the lesser of the two evils. I look at this presidential election, quite frankly, with two lousy candidates. They're both, I mean, with all the qualified people that we have out there, I mean, I think it's really, and I know McCain's a great patriot, and I know Barack Obama is quite intellectual, and he's a terrific, he's fabulous on his, in his oratory with a teleprompter. I had to get that in. But I'm really worried about that, and I hope not to cave in by saying, boy, I'm really getting scared. We need this regulation. Let's just do it. And I find myself saying these past days, based upon what you're hearing here, the alternative is Armageddon. And if the alternative is Armageddon, you know what you do? It's like Bush did on those tax rebates when we needed it. Whether you liked it or not, it was a Band-Aid on an open wound, but baby, did we need it. We needed it. You can always undo a procedure after you do it. What you have to do is attack it. If you don't have hospital facilities, use a tourniquet and then go and have the surgical procedure. That's what I'm afraid, I think that's what we may be dealing with right now, but there are far greater minds than mine who understand it. So that's my greatest fear.
Yes. Hi, Julia.
So I don't like regulation at all. I'm from Europe. We have way too much regulation. But so my point of view is just from an economic point of view, no political, is this. So the government is facing the situation. Either let the market go and we're facing the risk of a financial crisis. Nobody really knows, like he was saying, if it's going to happen, something like similar to the 30, smaller, we don't know. Or do something like bailing out this company, okay? Do something. And then the sure cost of doing something will be, like you say, $35 on each taxpayer. That's a sure cost. Why the government should not do that and face this sure cost of $35 rather than taking a chance of doing something? Sure.
$3,600 a person per year. I mean, that's a number that was thrown out.
Okay, it's not small. I'm not saying it's a small amount, but what I'm saying is that why should not face this sure cost of $35 rather than taking a chance of having something big happen? And then I hate recommend. I think once that this phase is passed, the next agenda for the next president should do some bipartisan regulation, like some serious one. But right now in this state, why shouldn't do that?
Well,
By the way, it might be a negative 3,500 because we don't know
right.
whether the 700 billion, if it's used to buy assets, whether the
Those assets will be worth anything.
may be worth more than 750 billion. They may
Or
be
whether
worth-
it'll take 20 years to sell them, and by then, what's the value?
Yeah, so it's a little bit up in the air.
I hate to use the word regulation, but I'm also, I think, a very rational person. And I'm just having a little fun. You don't mind a little fun, do you?
Of course not.
I think I think we should have some regulatory procedures, but not to the degree that I fear right now, where government ownership is so significant that it represents the antithesis of what how we were designed to be as a country. I wish I had more to say, but I don't have the answers. I really don't. I don't know what all the problems are.
I think, I have a different view. I think the regulation, it's pretty straightforward what we need to do, and I don't think we need to go overboard. I think we need to say these mortgages are safe and these are not. These credit card deals, we need to have the equivalent of an FDA in the financial area that says, it stamps these financial products is safe and these is not. We need to have the government rate securities, not leave it up to Moody's and S&P by themselves, because they're conflicted. They should be rating the securities, rating the companies. They should be auditing the top 500 companies. This is not that complicated, actually. It doesn't have to be the choice between capitalism and socialism, or the U.S. and the Soviet Union. I don't think that's at all the issue here. I think the issue is making sure that people understand what it is they're getting into. If they're consumers, they're going to buy a stock, they should be able to know exactly what assets that company has. It should be on the web, so they shouldn't have to guess what Fannie Mae owns or AIG. Disclosure. So there's a bunch of straightforward things that we can do to get us back onto the right track. And then there should be some, I think the major companies should have publicly appointed directors who are paid a fixed amount of money, independent of what, the CEO cannot basically bribe the directors to pay them super high salaries, so that we can get the CEOs to actually do their job. Because right now what you have is the CEO is paying these directors $500,000 a year, and the director's main job is to make sure the CEO is paid huge amounts of money and has a big parachute when they screw up. That's theft. And so there are some straightforward things that we can do here that are far short of socialism, in my view. Let me see if there's any other last questions, and then we're going to call quits because you all have to get to dinner. Anybody else? Okay, I want to thank Stu. John, you have a...
Throw out just one quick thing. There's bailouts and there's bailouts. The problem is we don't really know what the value is. But yesterday's New York Times,
Don't go, I have one more point to make. You want to hear?
okay.
No, go ahead, John.
Okay, Jeremy Siegel had an op-ed piece in the New York Times yesterday. That's sort of the 4 different types of bailouts. You take something like Chrysler.
Yep.
The whole issue taken over. Well, we came in, put it in. Government made a substantial profit as Chrysler was then returned back to the market. Or we bailed out Mexico in '95, $40 billion to bail out Mexico. Well, we got it all back with interest and so on, and it saved a calamity. So it may be a case where you're coming in to prevent a calamity the taxpayer could make on it.
Right.
It's not automatically a takeover in a way, but there's a lot of uncertainty.
Right, it's the uncertainty. The other thing, thank you for that point, private enterprise and investment. Do you know where we'd be today, for example, if the space program wasn't through NASA? It was through private enterprise and incentive-based programs. We're a society based upon incentives. We're not living as yet under socialism. You do better, you deserve more. If I've got 4 bathrooms and I want to give one, it would be voluntarily on my part to give one to someone who may need it. I don't want to be told that I have to do it. I like to think I'm generous in that respect. Private enterprise in an incentive-based society, we really need incentives. I think that's it. Thank you all very much. I hope you got one thing out of this, at least one. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.